We're so highly focused center of the plate on seafood versus a number of our food service competitors who can work with domestic products, beef, chicken, their proteins. So those are just some of the dynamics, just as a thought starter, the conversation to the extent that we can delve further. But those are just the components that we're specifically dealing with across food service. And I'm sure Eric has some perspective on impacts on retail as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Eric, you have a lot of experience with retail, and Ragnar put up a slide that showed that shrimp is somewhere around 25% to 30% of retail sales. I think you and I have figured anecdotally it's sometimes between 30 and 40, maybe. Talk to us about this, and what are retailers doing to adapt to this new tariff environment? What are they doing with their everyday pricing? Are they still running promotions? The whole picture.
So
there we go.
About that, yeah. So as far as what we've seen at retail sales have actually remained stable, and certain retailers actually have enjoyed a little growth in comparison to food service over the last year or so. As we have fingers in both markets, we recognize that the overall economy in the U.S. is more conducive to people maybe cooking at home, although we are seeing trade downs in proteins now. So by adding the extra stress of a tariff onto the pricing that's already perceived as being a little towards the higher side of protein choices, we can expect that more customers will drop out of the mix if the continued pressure on these prices warrants with the tariff impacts. What we've seen at retail is all retailers, discounters and high-low retailers alike, have increased prices at different rates in anticipation of the tariff impacting their goods now. So we are seeing some impacts. However, the promotional activity of these retailers is still driving sales to where we haven't seen a huge fall off yet. We're just getting into product now, which is impacted by the tariff. So we'll see through the summer months how that really impacts aggregate movement at retail. But our expectation is that every day, as you talked about, you didn't see yourself watching the news every morning. I started looking at currency exchange rates. Now it's all tariff all the time with every single customer and every salesperson we have. And that is overwhelmingly our conversations today with retailers, and it's continual projections and running multiple scenarios if things do change negatively or positively, as the hope is.
That's a great point. I would have to say that every single business day of my life since April 2nd, was that what it was, Bob? Has been involved with this. And the complexity of conversations just with customers to figure out how we're going to work with them to make this happen has been ridiculously disruptive. It's disrupted all the things that we're trying to do with our regular business. So that's a great point. Bob, speaking of which, now we'll give you a business question, but I hadn't even thought about this before, but you've got a lot of, you've had previous experience in government, including with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office in a prior life. I'm guessing that you kind of understand a little bit of the mentality of this administration. Do these government officials recognize the disruption of this? Do they care? What do they listen to? I know you and I have talked about the fact that they're not really interested to hear what we think of the policy, but they might be willing to talk about the execution. So for those of us that are frustrated and we don't know what's next, Are they cognizant of this, or what's happening there?
Yeah, that is a very good question. It's a very hard question. You're right, first of all, that there is a distinction in the administration between challenging the policy, which they're not too keen on, and challenging the trade facilitation issues of it. So we've had some success in talking to some of the agencies about what I call the on the water challenge, where the product departs for the United States before the executive order comes down, and yet there's some problems getting it in time so that it can have a duty-free entry, which, you know, in seafood, if you go back 7 years ago, most of the products that you were shipping to the United States were duty-free or 2.5% or what have you. Our actual weighted tariff average before all of this is 2.3%. So
Goods or seafood?
all goods,
Okay.
yes. Seafood, I think, would be lower, actually,
Yeah.
because we disproportionately bring seafood in from the developing world, and a lot of those products come in on either a preference program or just duty-free MFN rate. So there is a distinction there, and you can do good work with the administration in trying to make sure that they understand that just hammering the supply chain doesn't advance the policy. Having said that, I think, well, let me make one separate point also, because this is important to Indonesians. It's probably important to most of the Pacific Rim. You will notice in a lot of these documents and the public statements of the administration that they talk about allies as much as they talk about our strategic rivals and enemies. And the reciprocal tariffs mostly are aimed at countries that my government has all sorts of very productive relationships with, including this one. There is a frustration that the president has and has had for 30 or 40 years consistently, it must be stated, that America's trading relationships are unfair and imbalanced and rip off the American worker. I don't say that as a seafood specific thing at all, although there is some of that. But I say that in just generally goods and manufactured goods. The president has said publicly, aggressively, since the Reagan administration, when I was a child, that these relationships have been unfair. And if you look at the documents, there are a lot of references to things like VAT taxes, imbalanced relationships with allies. So that is not the cheeriest thought for you. And you could conceive of a world in which this would be really aimed just at China, the way it was in the first Trump administration. But we are past that. We are past that.
Matt, so do you and your executive team sit around and say, so what do we do if we go back to those original April 2 tariff rates?
Yes. So we have, I mentioned scenario planning, right? Contingency planning. So I think without having a crystal ball, we've been optimistic, and it was good to hear Bob say that the expectation is that we're going to continue to work toward these bilateral trade agreements with the countries that are really relevant to us in the seafood space. But we do have some, a lot of our menu planning process has evolved around, what do we do if shrimp prices, because we use shrimp fairly regularly as a promotional item, how do we shift our promotional focus? So there's a pretty significant amount of discussion going on, not only about product mix and how we align menu strategy, but also on inventory planning. I think that's the other piece we were hitting on, whether it's on the water. We've evolved to a vendor-managed inventory. Red Lobster, as previous iterations of our company, owned a lot of our own seafood. We've moved away from that process and moved to a vendor-managed inventory policy with the vast majority of our suppliers. So a lot of the work we've been doing up front is to build as much contingency and as much inventory protection as we can. But it still remains very highly volatile. And to your point, Travis, I mean, I hit on this earlier, but It's looking at portion size. You know, we're always going to have shrimp on our menu. Historically, it's always been over 50% of our seafood mix. It's been as high as 65%. We're closer to the lower end of that range right now. 50 to 55% of our menu has a shrimp feature. And whether it's, you know, we've all, you know, heard about the endless shrimp and the different things that Red Lobster has done over the years. We're looking at how we manage that back to controllable portions and have it as a component. Maybe we're doing a shrimp and chicken or a shrimp and beef option, and just finding ways to mitigate through usage as well as mix. So quite a bit of contingency planning and quite a bit of flexibility we have to have despite being a very large company. And it can be difficult to flip the switch, but we've got some processes that enable us to do that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, I think when we all spoke prior to this, Eric, we kind of talked about the fact that even if you don't look at the numbers, anecdotally, it kind of felt like after a rough 2023 and 2024 was here that things were starting to kind of feel a little bit better. Of course, this threw a wrench. This is an English phrase, threw a wrench in our spokes, or absolutely just turned everything upside down. But Eric, what was happening in both food service and retail sales in the U.S. prior to this news over the last year or so? It's kind of trending in general.
So what's interesting is overall, and this kind of, and if it's okay, I'd love to ask a question between Bob and Ragnar after this. Yeah, I know, because I have noticed, I've seen, and maybe it's just me, that the American consumers are making different choices. As I had mentioned, I've already seen over the past year a little bit of a trade down, and at retail, particularly, even and at food service, I've seen promotional activity. When it's increased, that's what drives sales. Okay, day-to-day sales, I sense, are not great. I think I think we have to go back to pre-pandemic times when off ad, there were still people buying and cooking at home. And I'd say as a result of the pandemic, more people have learned how to cook seafood products in general, not just shrimp. And that, you know, in one way was a positive, but I've noticed that people, as their you know, disposable incomes relative to what they're gaining seem to shrink almost. I mean, that's my sense and feeling on whether it's factual or not. I'm not talking from an economist standpoint. I just, again, notice and see these trends. And my question actually also to Bob first would be, does the administration recognize any economic impact of, on the what a household, yes, on people from the town?
Yeah. Well, not yet, I would say. That's the simple answer. And the reason for that is that the market, the Wall Street market collapse that we had on the cusp of in April, which led to the 90-day pause on the reciprocal numbers. The consumer didn't feel that because it takes a little time to have that happen, obviously. And then now you're paying 10%, which the administration has a lot of experience with a 10% number because we started in China 7 years ago with a 10% tariff, and nobody cared in the consumer market. Nobody cared. They did not care. So the answer to that is not yet. Now, what happens when the lower price inventory gets cleared out in a few months? What happens when consumer staples start increasing and more of a higher percentage of the tariff is passed through the supply chain as it imposed on the consumer, which at some point you would think is inevitable. At some point, I don't know when. What happens when that happens? The American consumer is going to get cranky. Our economy, Ragnar, correct me if I'm wrong, our economy, the gross domestic product of our country is 2/3 consumption. The GDP of China, by comparison, is 40%. consumption. 4-0. So we have the largest economy in the world, and 67% of our economy is based on consumption activity. The second largest economy in the world, or the largest, maybe China, is the flip side of that. It's the mirror opposite. If you think that one of the undercurrents here is that the administration is trying to shift the United States economy away from a consumer-driven economy to more of a producer economy, that is extraordinarily difficult to do. And even if you think it can be done in the near term, there's going to be a lot of dislocation and disruption. So that's the answer. I have good, as Travis often notes, that I have good news wherever I go, and that's my good news.
That's right. Good question, Eric. Thank you. Ragnar, I did not prepare you for this question, but that's why you're my favorite Norwegian. Do you know if we have any historical data in the seafood industry of other situations where large tariffs have been imposed and then we have seen a redistribution of products to other countries? And what I really mean by that is, can this get to a point where, have we seen mathematically that, and we'll talk about this in a moment with the other panelists, is this going to send shrimp to other parts of the world, more shrimp other places? Because that's interesting to all of our producer people here, because they've got to figure out where to go.
Yeah, I think, well, not necessarily on tariffs, but if you look at closure of markets for other seafood products, we have the history of Russia closing completely to imports on salmon. A business that was at the time, I think close to 15% of the Norwegian salmon exports went to Russia. And that was closed overnight with an import ban. And it took really not more than a month or two until, let's say, that volume was distributed to other markets. So I think that's one of the characteristics that's why I still am in the seafood business. It's very dynamic, it's very proactive, and exporters and traders, they know how to deal with these types of crises or changes. Maybe one comment to Eric, the question you didn't ask, but on down trading. I think just looking at the US market, being it retail or food service, I think if you look at within the seafood category, what should you down trade to? That's also a big question, because if we look at the situation for, let's say, ground fish or whitefish from the North Atlantic, but also the Pacific, we are probably looking at the worst kind of quota or supply situation in more than a decade. So there isn't much other kind of product to down trade to in the value category. Maybe the only kind of interesting part is on the salmon side, where salmon has for many years been considered that, well, there's limited possibility for growth due to regulations. There's just limited space, and we have seen prices hike for the past few years. But there has been on the European side a really strong shift in productivity. Growth has been better, survival is better, and with let's say the drivers, warmer seawater temperatures during the winter, we have seen feed sales in Europe growing by more than 20%. Nobody expected it. So salmon has gone from being expected as this will be another spring with really high prices to being the product you can get really at affordable prices compared to what the expectations were. So yeah, but I think the big question is, yeah, Will it be down trading within the seafood category, or will consumers look outside the seafood category?
You guys both picked up the mics. This is going to be good. Go ahead.
I mean, I think Ragnar's right. I think the ground fish and the fin fish are the most natural places that you would first look to down trade. Whitefish is still very competitive from an overall price perspective. Salmon, there's a lot of diversity in salmon production now as well. Outside of Europe, which the current trade tariff policies with Europe are not favorable to the U.S. right now. So we're looking at places like South America, Canada, other places where we have more favorable policies. So I think those are certainly areas where it would be natural to look to down trade. But shrimp does still, what I want to reiterate, for this audience especially, is that shrimp does still occupy a very attractive space, right? It's just how do we work together, and how are companies like us going to look at maybe diversifying our country of origin, or where the production is taking place, maybe trying to migrate from nominally higher cost countries or ones that we perceive more risk with, to countries where there are more attractive production and raw material opportunities, of which Indonesia is certainly a country that we're spending a lot of time evaluating right now, along with some others. So yeah, I mean, and the other point, I think domestically in the US, outside of the seafood space, or maybe companies that dabble in seafood, is they're shifting their mix more to domestic land-based proteins, right? I think, and that's every seafood conversation that I have, there's always this overwhelming notion that, what can we all do to work together to increase consumption of seafood? Hearing Dr. Crane earlier describe the health benefits, there's so many reasons why promoting seafood is really good, not only for the economy, but good for us as individuals. So we've got to find a way to continue to work together to develop and find ways to maximize a win-win type benefit for us to be able to promote and push consumption in the United States, and to work productively with the producers and the raw material suppliers to find effective ways to bring those products to market safely and continuously.
The main concern that I see voiced in, you echoed a lot of my sentiments, Matt, and Dr. Crane came right into my brain when we were talking about this as well. But the retail people that I speak with, the category managers, they're managing multiple proteins. So they're not just focused on seafood only. And what they're seeing is a trade out of seafood, because you're not going to replace shrimp's popularity. You're not going to replace ease, and that's what's made salmon so popular as well, the ease and preparation, and people have become very familiar with those items. And if they price themselves out, people might switch protein, to a different category protein. Whereas you mentioned, you kind of said something about hot dogs, ground beef, chicken. I mean, chicken breast is still less expensive than most seafood items that I can think of at retail. And I don't see where that's going to change, especially since they're domestically produced.
Great, thank you. That about wraps it up. I would say, and I'm sure you guys would agree, that we have faced massive headwinds in this industry before. In the U.S., we had the anti-dumping cases of 2004, 2005, when that started. We've had additional countervailing duty cases ever since. We've dealt with EMS, we've dealt with other problems throughout the years, but we always overcome, right? We always overcome. So thanks to our panelists. We appreciate you guys. Big hand for you guys.